On a quiet Christmas week in a mountain town, where winter rules and silence feels heavier than snow, an officer vanished into a storm, and the town believed the story had already ended. They closed the roads, they closed the case, they prepared a funeral, but one dog refused to listen. Before this story begins, I want to know where you are watching from today. Please leave your city or country in the comments, because your voice matters here. If you believe in stories of loyalty, hope, and second chances, please press subscribe to support this YouTube channel and stay with us for a story that proves sometimes the greatest miracles arrive quietly through faith, patience, and a heart that refuses the wrong ending. Hearthstone Pass sat high in the Rockies like a town the world forgot on purpose. A tight knot of cabins and salt-stained pickup trucks tucked between dark fir forests and a ridgeline that chewed up weather systems for fun. In the week before Christmas, the sky stayed the color of pewter, and snow came down in slow, tidy curtains, patient flakes that softened rooftops, muted footsteps, and made the whole place feel as if it had agreed to whisper instead of talk. Garlands hung on porch rails, lights blinked bravely against the gloom, and candles glowed behind frosted windows like small dares aimed at the dark. But grief, when it arrived, never checked for holiday decorations. It barged in wearing cold boots and no manners. Officer Miles Calloway had been one of those men who looked like he belonged outdoors even when he was standing under fluorescent office lights. He was 36, tall without trying to be, broad-shouldered in a way that came from carrying gear rather than lifting for show, with storm-gray eyes that rarely wasted emotion, and a jawline that made most people assume he was always calm. His hair was kept short in the practical law enforcement way, dark with a hint of wave, and his face had the steady, weathered patience of someone who had spent too many nights listening to other people's emergencies. In town, folks said Miles was quiet but not cold, polite without being performative. He didn't charm crowds, he reassured them. There had been an incident years ago, a pileup on the pass that left him pulling strangers out of twisted metal until his hands bled through his gloves. Nobody called him a hero to his face after that. They didn't need to. The way he spoke, measured, careful, carried the mark of a man who had learned the cost of panic. On Monday evening, 4 days before Christmas, the weather shifted from peaceful snowfall to something sharper. The wind started running sideways, scraping ice crystals across the road like sandpaper. The radio crackled with the kind of static that always sounded like trouble trying to hide. Miles had been on whiteout patrol, the sort of duty that was half routine and half faith. Drive slow, watch for stranded travelers, try not to become the stranded traveler yourself. Dispatch logged the call at 1918. A report of a vehicle possibly stalled near ridge marker 12, just past the bend where the guardrail disappeared into a steep drop, and the world below looked like a black mouth. Miles acknowledged. His voice on the recording was steady, a simple copy, followed by the soft click of a mic released. That was the last clear thing anyone heard from him. By 2003, the storm was eating the signal. By 2020, it was eating the road. And by 2037, Hearthstone Pass was doing what it always did when winter wanted to prove a point. It sealed itself off. The search started with the sheriff's department, a handful of deputies who knew the mountain like a relative they didn't entirely trust. At the center of it was Sheriff Bo Rourke, a man who looked carved rather than born, late 40s, thick through the chest, shoulders like old timber, with a beard that had more silver than he would admit. Bo's eyes were a warm brown that made people think he was gentle until he spoke, because his voice had the weight of someone used to being obeyed. He wasn't loud. He didn't have to be. His temperament was the kind that stayed level even when everyone else tilted, an oak in a storm, not because he felt no fear, but because he'd decided fear didn't get to drive. Bo had grown up in places like this, where a winter mistake could become a headstone. He believed in procedure the way some men believe in prayer, not because it was comforting, but because it was what you held on to when the wind tried to take everything else. In the sheriff's office, while radios hissed and phones rang and someone kept dropping gloves because their hands were shaking, Vesper waited. Vesper was a German Shepherd Cape-Sign, 5 years old, prime working age, built like a piece of athletic architecture. Deep chest, powerful hindquarters, a neck that carried his head high with natural authority. His coat was sable, a gradient of warm tan and black that made him look like he was forever stepping out of shadow. His ears stood sharp and alert, and his eyes were bright amber, with a steady judging intelligence that gave the unsettling impression he was always evaluating whether humans were being sensible. He wore a harness marked K9 with official patches and a sturdy leather collar that had been broken in by miles and seasons. Most people who didn't know working dogs assumed German Shepherds were either cuddly movie heroes or snarling threats. Vesper was neither. He was disciplined, controlled, and quiet. A professional who did not waste energy on unnecessary noise. He loved Miles the way a soldier loves the one who watches their flank. Not clingy, not theatrical, but absolute. They had trained together for years, tracking, apprehension, obedience, scent work. Miles had learned how to read Vesper's smallest signals, the tension in a shoulder, a change in breathing, the precise tilt of an ear that meant the dog had noticed something the world hadn't yet admitted was there. In return, Vesper had learned Miles's cadence, his commands, his patience. They moved like two parts of one instrument. In the town stories, Miles was the steady hand, and Vesper was the blade that never dulled. That night, Vesper sat near the kennel gate, leash clipped to the hook like it was waiting for a hand that had not arrived. He did not pace. He did not whine. But anyone paying attention would have noticed the way his gaze kept lifting toward the door, as if expecting it to open on a schedule the world had forgotten. When the search team finally found Miles, it wasn't dramatic. There was no triumphant spotlight from a helicopter, no heroic chorus in the wind. There was only a half-buried shape near the ridgeline, tucked against a snowbank, as if the mountain had tried to keep him. His uniform was stiff with ice. His skin was pale beneath the frost. The cold had done what cold does. It had made him look like an answer. They brought him back to town on a stretcher, the kind of quiet return that makes a place feel smaller. The clinic was cramped and dim because the storm had been chewing at the power grid all day. The lights flickered like nervous thoughts. A backup generator groaned and then settled into an inconsistent hum. The portable monitor the county kept for emergencies was old, finicky, and, under those conditions, unreliable. The county's temporary medical examiner, Dr. Everett Shaw, was the man standing between hope and paperwork. He was in his early 60s with a tired face and thin hair that looked permanently tousled, as if he'd stopped caring what mirrors thought of him. His glasses slid down his nose when he was stressed, and his hands were the hands of someone who had spent a career doing careful work under imperfect circumstances. Everett wasn't a villain. He was an exhausted professional filling in during the holidays because someone had to. He had driven in from a lower county after another examiner came down with the flu, and the storm had trapped him here like it trapped everyone. His personality was clinical and cautious, but the kind of caution that sometimes turns into premature certainty when the world is demanding speed. He did the checks the best way he could. He listened, he looked, he tried the monitor, which failed to hold a clean reading. The cold had pulled Miles's body inward, slowing everything down to a near whisper. Hypothermia was a thief like that, stealing heat, slowing breath, dimming heartbeat, until even experienced eyes could be fooled if the tools weren't cooperating. And the room wasn't warm, and the clock wasn't screaming. Outside, roads were closing. The helicopter couldn't fly. The storm pressed against the building like a hand against glass. Somebody, maybe a deputy, maybe a nurse, maybe just the air itself, said the words everyone wanted to hear because they thought it would end the uncertainty. He's gone. The sentence fell heavy. The kind of sentence that ends conversations. Sheriff Bo Rourke stood in the doorway, jaw set, hands clenched at his sides. He didn't argue, not because he believed it fully, but because he could see the exhaustion in everyone's faces and the fear under their professionalism. People rarely argue with a declaration that, final when it arrives, wrapped in authority and time pressure. But in the sheriff's office, back where the air smelled of wet wool and coffee that had been sitting too long, Vesper lifted his head. A deputy named Lila Moreno, mid-30s, average height, quick-eyed, dark hair pulled into a messy bun beneath her beanie, had been tasked with keeping things calm at the EO station. Lila was the kind of officer who coped with stress by getting efficient, making lists, checking gear, sharpening chaos into tasks. She approached Vesper's kennel with a cautious softness. She wasn't afraid of him. She respected him. The town knew Vesper's reputation. Everyone did. The funeral director arrived later, a local man named Hank Dobbins, short, neatly dressed, hair combed back with more care than the weather deserved, voice gentle in that practiced way people in his profession develop. Hank's manner was always polite, always measured, as if he believed emotions were fragile objects that needed to be carried with two hands. He spoke with Bo, and then, with quiet respect, approached the kennel. "We'll bring him in for a viewing," Hank said softly, more to the room than to the dog, as if announcing a weather report nobody wanted. "Just so everyone can say goodbye proper." Vesper's ears rose. He did not howl. He did not thrash. He simply stood up, smooth and controlled, and fixed his stare on the door. It wasn't the stare of grief. It was the stare of attention, the kind a working dog gives when he hears a command. His posture changed in a way only handlers and seasoned deputies would recognize. A subtle tightening of purpose, the readiness of an animal who believes something was unfinished. Lila swallowed, suddenly uneasy. "Hey, boy," she murmured, trying for lightness that didn't quite land. "Your partner's—" She stopped herself. It felt wrong to say it out loud in front of him, as if the dog might challenge the words. Bo watched from the hallway, a man trying to hold the town together with his bare hands. The Christmas lights in the lobby blinked cheerfully beside the bulletin board of missing pets and snowplow schedules, as if the season didn't realize it had chosen the wrong week to be festive. Vesper didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. His focus stayed on the door like it was a horizon line, and everything beyond it mattered more than the rules of the room. He stood there, still, silent, certain, as if he'd heard a footstep no one else could hear. And in that rigid calm was the first crack in the town's conclusion. Not proof, not yet. Just a refusal so quiet, it felt like a prophecy waiting for daylight. In towns like Hearthstone Pass, funerals did not linger. They moved quickly, not because love was shallow, but because winter was ruthless, and time felt borrowed once the roads began to close. People learned early that hesitation could cost more than haste, and so grief was often folded neatly, pressed into schedules and rituals, and carried forward with stiff backs and reddened eyes. The service for Officer Miles Calloway was set for Christmas Eve, a decision made with practical voices and heavy hearts. A closed casket ceremony, they agreed. Kinder that way. Safer. The cold had already taken enough. The morning of the funeral arrived under a sky the color of old tin. Snow drifted down steadily, not violent, but relentless, coating the town in a fresh silence that erased yesterday's tire tracks and softened the sharpest corners of memory. Hearthstone Pass looked almost gentle that morning. Pine branches sagged under white weight, and the church at the edge of Main Street glowed with warm light, its windows fogged by breath and quiet sobs. Wreaths of evergreen and red ribbon decorated the doors, symbols of life stubbornly displayed in defiance of loss. Inside the church, the air smelled of wax, pine, and wool, damp from melting snow. Candles flickered along the walls, their flames steady despite the draft, as if even the fire understood the need for composure. Townspeople filled the pews in heavy coats and dark scarves, faces drawn and pale. Many of them had known Miles not just as an officer, but as a presence, someone who showed up when things went wrong and stayed calm while others fell apart. His absence felt louder than the hymns. At the front of the church rested the casket, polished dark wood adorned with a simple wreath. The lid was sealed, the metal latches gleaming faintly in the candlelight. The decision to keep it closed had been made quickly by Hank Dobbins, the funeral director, a short, meticulous man in his late 50s with careful hands and a voice trained to never rise above sorrow. Hank believed in order. In moments like these, he thought order was mercy. He had prepared Miles with respect, guided by paperwork and procedure, telling himself that some sights were better left unseen. Sheriff Bo Rourke stood near the front, his broad frame somehow heavier than usual, his shoulders bowed as if the roof itself rested there. His beard was trimmed for the occasion, but his eyes were rimmed red, and the lines around them seemed deeper. Bo was a man accustomed to responsibility, but grief sat on him awkwardly, like a coat that didn't quite fit. He clasped his hands together, knuckles white, and stared at the casket as if willing it to explain itself. Beside the aisle, Deputy Lila Moreno moved quietly, guiding people to seats, offering small nods and murmured words. She wore her uniform beneath a long black coat, her dark hair pulled back tight, her expression composed. Lila had always been efficient in crises, but today her movements were slower, more deliberate, as if she were afraid that any sudden gesture might crack the fragile calm holding the room together. Vesper entered the church last. He walked beside Bo, leash held firmly but without tension, his gait smooth and controlled. The German shepherd's sable coat caught the candlelight, highlighting the strong lines of his body and the alert set of his ears. At 5 years old, he was at the height of his strength, every muscle conditioned by training and duty. His amber eyes scanned the room, not nervously, but with a quiet assessment that made several people straighten unconsciously. Vesper was not dressed in mourning. He wore his harness, official patches intact, a reminder that he was here not as a symbol, but as a partner. "He deserves to say goodbye," Bo had said earlier, his voice rough when he asked Hank for permission. Hank had hesitated, then nodded. No one in Hearthstone Pass argued with the bond between a K9 and his handler. It was understood, respected, almost sacred. At first, Vesper behaved exactly as expected. He sat when Bo stopped. He remained silent, his posture upright, his breathing slow and even. He did not pull toward the casket. He did not whine or paw or show any of the frantic behaviors people associated with grief in animals. To the untrained eye, he looked calm, professional, almost indifferent. But those who knew working dogs noticed the details, the subtle tightening along his shoulders, the way his ears angled forward, then shifted slightly as the room settled, the way his nostrils flared, not in curiosity, but in focus. When the pallbearers lifted the casket to move it closer to the front, their steps careful on the polished floor, something in Vesper changed. It was not sudden, it was precise. His head lowered a fraction, his spine aligning, his weight shifting forward as if an internal switch had been flipped. He rose smoothly from his sit and walked toward the casket without a sound. A murmur rippled through the pews. Some people smiled sadly, assuming this was the beginning of a farewell they had seen in movies, a loyal dog paying respects. Others stiffened, uneasy with any deviation from the script of mourning. Vesper approached the casket and stopped inches from the seam where the lid met the base. He lowered his head and inhaled slowly, deliberately. This was not a casual sniff. It was the methodical intake of an animal trained to read the invisible. His nose traced the edge of the wood, pausing near the latch. Then he froze. One muscle along his back tightened, visible beneath his thick coat. His ears pricked sharply. His breathing changed, shallow and controlled, as if he were listening to something beneath the layers of wood and varnish. Without warning, a single bark shattered the quiet. It was sharp, clean, and unmistakably urgent. Gasps echoed through the church. A woman in the second pew clutched her chest. Someone whispered, "Oh, God." Another voice, strained and embarrassed, murmured, "He's grieving." Hank Dobbins stepped forward instinctively, one hand raised. "It's all right," he said softly, though his eyes flicked nervously to Bo. Animals sense loss differently. A man reached for Vesper's collar, intending to guide him away gently. Vesper stepped between the hand and the casket. A low growl rolled from his chest, not wild, not aggressive, but firm. A warning. The sound of a boundary being drawn. His body was rigid now, his stance wide and grounded, every inch of him radiating controlled refusal. The pastor faltered mid-sentence, his prepared words dissolving in the air. Silence flooded back in, heavier than before. Then Vesper did something no one expected. He lowered himself and pressed the side of his head, his cheek, warm and solid, against the casket. His eyes closed halfway, not in sorrow, but in concentration. His ears twitched, adjusting minutely, as if tuning into a frequency just beyond human reach. And he stayed like that. No barking, no movement, just stillness. Minutes stretched, uncomfortable and electric. People shifted in their seats. Someone began to cry quietly, the sound thin and confused. Silence like this was harder to dismiss than noise. Barking could be written off as instinct or emotion. This listening felt intentional, purposeful. Sheriff Bo Rourke stepped closer, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He knelt beside the casket, his large hand hovering uncertainly over the polished wood. "Vesper," he whispered, his voice breaking on the dog's name, half command, half prayer. Vesper did not look at him. He lifted his head just enough to release one more bark, short, sharp, urgent, not grief, alarm, the kind that demanded action. And for the first time since the storm had taken miles, doubt crept into the room like a living thing, unsettling the lie everyone had needed in order to move forward. At first, the room reacted the way humans always did when an animal interrupted grief. They tried to make it polite. A man near the back cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the hush. Maybe the dog should be taken outside, he murmured, not unkindly but firmly, as if order itself were trembling and needed rescuing. A woman beside him nodded, dabbing her eyes. Someone else whispered, embarrassed by the sudden spark of hope they didn't know how to hold. He doesn't understand. But Vesper understood perfectly. He remained pressed against the casket, his body still as carved stone, his ears angled forward with microscopic precision. Every sense he possessed was focused inward, toward what the wood concealed. His discipline was intact, no frantic scratching, no wild movement, just unwavering attention. This was not a pet pleading for comfort. This was a working dog delivering information in the only language he had. Sheriff Bo Rourke straightened slowly, his joints stiff, his breath shallow. Up close, the years on him showed more clearly. The creases carved by weather and worry, the shoulders that had carried too many decisions alone. Bo had buried men before. He had signed papers, folded flags, spoken careful words to families whose worlds had ended in a single phone call. He knew the rituals. He believed in them because they kept chaos at bay. But standing there now, watching Vesper refuse to move, Bo felt something old and uneasy stir beneath his ribs. He knelt beside the casket. Up close, the wood smelled faintly of polish and pine sap, the wreath above it releasing a bitter green scent that clung to the air. Bo placed his palm flat against the lid, expecting cold, dead stillness. That was what logic promised. That was what he had already accepted. He felt nothing. And yet, he didn't pull his hand away. Vesper shifted then, lifting one paw and placing it gently against the lower edge of the casket. Not scratching, not clawing, just a measured tap, as precise as a knock on a door you believe someone might still answer. His amber eyes flicked briefly toward Bo, then back to the wood. The message was unmistakable. Bo swallowed hard. He leaned closer, his ear hovering near the spot where the dog had pressed his cheek moments earlier. The church seemed to hold its breath with him. The hum of the heater, the faint crackle of candles, the rustle of coats, all of it receded until there was only the sound of his own pulse roaring in his head. At first, he heard nothing but himself. Then, beneath the noise of his fear and doubt, something else slipped through. A sound so faint it might have been imagined. A shallow rasp. A whisper of air, uneven and fragile, like breath unsure whether it was allowed to exist. Bo froze. His eyes flew open, wide and unblinking. He lifted his head just enough to look at Vesper, whose body had gone rigid with confirmation. The dog's ears twitched once, twice, adjusting, locking in. "Get the medic," Bo said, his voice cracking like ice under sudden weight. "Now." Hank Dobbins stepped back instinctively, his careful composure faltering. "Sheriff," he began, one hand hovering uncertainly over the latch. "The paperwork is done. The examiner—" "Paper doesn't outrank breath," Bo snapped, the oak in his voice splintering just enough to show steel beneath. "Move!" Deputy Lila Moreno was already running, her boots pounding against the church floor as she shoved the doors open and disappeared into the snow, breath tearing from her lungs as she fumbled for her radio. Her efficiency fractured into urgency, but she did not slow. People stood now, confusion rippling outward like a shock wave. Some prayed aloud, some cried harder, the sound breaking into something desperate and unfamiliar. A few shook their heads, unable or unwilling to believe what was unfolding, clinging to the safety of finality. Vesper did not move. He stood guard at the casket, head high, body angled protectively, as if daring doubt itself to come closer. The volunteer EMT arrived minutes later, breathless and pale, her parka half-zipped from haste. Tamsin Vale was 28, slight of build, with sharp eyes that missed very little and hands that rarely trembled while she was working. She had moved to Hearthstone Pass 2 years earlier, after a near-fatal highway accident during her residency changed her understanding of time. Since then, she treated every call like it mattered more than the clock. Her brown hair was pulled back tightly, strands escaping to frame a face marked by concentration rather than softness. She knelt immediately, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She placed her stethoscope against the wood where Bo pointed, her expression professional, guarded. Seconds passed, her brow furrowed. I think I hear something, she said quietly, disbelief edging her voice. She shifted the stethoscope, repositioned it, closed her eyes to listen harder. It's very weak. Before anyone could respond, the casket gave a tiny, unmistakable movement. Not a knock, not a dramatic plea, just a subtle shift, a reflex, a body reminding the world it had not yet let go. A sound tore from the crowd, a collective gasp that felt like the church itself had inhaled too sharply. Hank staggered back a step, one hand gripping the pew behind him. Someone sobbed openly now, the careful dignity of the service shattered beyond repair. Tamsin looked up, her eyes blazing with sudden clarity. "This is severe hypothermia," she said, voice firm, rising over the chaos. "People can look dead. Heart rate, breathing, they drop so low they're almost undetectable. He needs to be warmed, slowly, right now." She turned to Bo. "Open it." For a moment, no one moved. The idea felt sacrilegious, as if opening the casket might tear the fragile hope apart. The room balanced on a knife's edge between miracle and madness. Then Bo reached for the latch. His hands shook. He did not care. The lid opened with a soft, final click that echoed louder than thunder in the silence that followed. Miles Calloway lay inside, pale as winter itself. His skin was waxy, lips tinged blue, eyelashes dusted with frost that had not fully melted. His chest rose, barely. So faintly it was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A man misread as gone because the cold had stolen his signals and hidden them in plain sight. "He's alive," Tamsin said, the words sharp and absolute. "Barely, but he's alive." Vesper moved then, swift and sure. He sprang up onto his hind legs just long enough to press his full warmth against Miles's side, his body curved protectively, his breath steady and hot against the frozen uniform. He did not lick. He did not whine. He simply became heat, living insulation, doing what instinct and training demanded. The church exploded into motion. Blankets were shouted for. Phones came out, hands fumbling as calls were placed to the clinic, to the hospital down the mountain, to anyone who might help. Tamsin was already issuing instructions, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Do not jostle him. We need heat packs near the core. Oxygen ready. Gently." And for the first time since the storm began, Hearthstone Pass stopped mourning and started fighting, not against death, against time. No one carried Miles Calloway like a hero. They carried him like glass. The moment the truth cracked open the room, discipline replaced disbelief. Grief had no authority here anymore. Only time did. EMT Tamsin Vale moved with sharp economy, her earlier tremor burned away by instinct and training. She directed hands, voices, bodies into purpose. Blankets were layered carefully, not wrapped tight, but placed strategically. Core first, never extremities, the old rule drilled into her during a winter rescue seminar she'd once nearly skipped. Heat packs followed, shielded by cloth, positioned near the chest and abdomen. Oxygen hissed softly as a mask was fitted with delicate care. "Slow," Tamsin warned, eyes flicking to anyone who moved too fast. "Hypothermia patients can crash if you rush them. We warm him, not shock him back." Sheriff Bo Rourke hovered close, useless and necessary at the same time. His hands trembled now that they had nothing immediate to do. He watched Miles's chest with the intensity of a man trying to memorize motion, as if afraid it might vanish if he blinked. Bo had commanded men through blizzards and standoffs, but this fragile, almost invisible breath, felt more terrifying than any firefight. Vesper stayed pressed against Miles's side until Tamsin gently nudged him back. "I need room," she said softly, not unkindly. "You did good, buddy?" Vesper stepped back immediately, obedience ingrained, but he did not retreat far. He positioned himself near Miles's feet, sitting upright, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of his partner's chest, like a lighthouse tracking a ship in dangerous water. His presence radiated calm, a silent assurance that steadied shaking hands around him. Outside, the storm raged without apology. Snow whipped sideways through the open church doors as the stretcher was maneuvered out, wind biting exposed skin with savage efficiency. The ambulance waited like a red and white beast in the street, engine running, lights slicing through the whiteout in urgent pulses. The siren did not scream. It wailed low and constant, a sound less like celebration and more like confession. We almost got it wrong. Deputy Lila Moreno helped guide the stretcher, her face tight with concentration. Snow clung to her lashes, melted, then froze again. Her mind replayed the moment she'd nearly accepted the lie, how easily she'd nodded, how grateful she'd been for certainty. The realization made her stomach twist. She vowed silently that she would never again confuse finality with truth. At the ambulance doors, a paramedic stepped forward and hesitated when Vesper moved to follow. "We can't," he began, then stopped, really looking at the dog for the first time. Not frantic, not disruptive, calm, focused, working. The canine harness bore official tags, the leather worn smooth by years of service. This was not an animal out of control. This was a professional who had already saved a life. The paramedic exhaled. "All right," he said finally. "He stays back." Vesper climbed into the ambulance with measured steps and settled near Miles's boots, body angled to avoid interference, eyes never leaving his handler. The doors slammed shut, sealing warmth inside as the vehicle lurched forward, tires fighting for traction. The ride was brutal. The road twisted like a serpent under ice, visibility reduced to a few desperate yards. Every bump threatened catastrophe. Tamsin braced herself, one hand steadying the equipment, the other monitoring Miles's vitals with hawk-like focus. His heartbeat flickered on the monitor, slow, erratic, but present. Every blip felt like a small victory wrestled from winter's grip. "Stay with us," she murmured, not sure if she was speaking to Miles or to herself. Vesper's ears twitched at the sound of Miles's faint breath, his body subtly adjusting, absorbing the motion of the ambulance to keep himself from sliding. He did not whine. He did not interfere. He simply watched, his amber eyes reflecting the flashing lights, as if memorizing each second. The hospital doors burst open into controlled chaos. Hearthstone Regional was small but competent, a building that had learned to punch above its weight because mountains didn't care about budgets. Nurses moved like a practice storm, guiding the stretcher through double doors, voices overlapping in sharp, efficient bursts. A doctor barked orders. Machines sang their urgent songs, beeps, alarms, the mechanical language of survival. Vesper was stopped at the ER threshold. Rules were rules. Animals did not cross this line. For a moment he stood there, confused not by the barrier itself, but by the separation. His body leaned forward, muscles tensing, ready to follow. Then training reasserted itself. He sat, right at the door, straight-backed, alert, a carved guardian. The doors swung shut, cutting off sight and sound of Miles, leaving Vesper alone with the waiting room and the people who did not know what to do with hope yet. Christmas decorations blinked cheerfully from the corners, a plastic tree, tinsel-catching fluorescent light, a paper snowman taped crookedly to the wall. The contrast was almost obscene. Sheriff Bo Rourke paced the length of the waiting room, boots thudding softly against linoleum. He stopped near Vesper, lowered himself into a chair with a grunt, and leaned forward, elbows on knees. For the first time since he'd pinned on a badge, Bo felt the weight of a mistake he hadn't made, but might have allowed. Across the room, Tamsin emerged briefly to wash blood from her hands, her face pale but focused. Her hands shook only when she paused, when there was nothing immediate demanding them. She caught Bo's eye and gave a single, tight nod. Not reassurance, information. "He's hanging on," she said quietly. "That's all I can promise right now." Hours passed. Christmas Eve bled into Christmas night. Snow continued to fall, relentless, burying the roads, the town, the idea of easy endings. The waiting room grew quieter as people were sent home, urged to rest, told they would be called. Bo refused to leave. So did Lila, who sat curled in a chair with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands. Vesper did not sleep. He remained seated by the ER doors, eyes trained on the narrow gap beneath them, ears catching every shift in sound beyond. Footsteps, voices, the faint roll of equipment. He listened the way he had listened at the casket, with patience, with faith rooted not in belief, but in attention, as if listening itself were an act of defiance. Winter pressed against the hospital walls, furious at being denied. Inside, machines hummed, people whispered, and a town learned what it meant to fight not with force, but with refusal. Refusal to give up. Refusal to rush. Refusal to let silence decide the ending. Near midnight, the waiting room of Hearthstone Regional felt suspended outside of time. The clock above the nurse's station ticked with exaggerated patience, each second too loud in the hush. Christmas Eve had slipped quietly into Christmas night without ceremony, as if the date itself did not dare interrupt what was happening behind the closed doors of the emergency department. Snow continued to fall beyond the windows, thick and steady, blurring the parking lot lights into soft halos that looked almost gentle if one forgot how dangerous the storm still was. Sheriff Bo Rourke had not moved from his chair in over an hour. His large hands rested on his knees, fingers curled slightly inward, as though holding something fragile only he could feel. The strength in his frame had drained into stillness. His broad shoulders slumped just enough to reveal the man beneath the badge. His eyes remained fixed on the ER doors, unblinking, as if looking away might invite the wrong outcome. Bo was not praying in words. He had never been good with those, but something inside him kept repeating a single thought, steady and stubborn. Not yet. Deputy Lila Moreno sat a few seats away, her coat folded neatly beside her, boots dusted white from dried snow. She looked smaller out of uniform, knees drawn up slightly, arms wrapped around herself more for grounding than warmth. Lila had built her career on preparation and control, but tonight had dismantled both. The idea that certainty could be wrong, that death itself could be mistaken, had cracked something open in her. She watched Vesper often, finding unexpected comfort in the dog's unwavering focus. If he could wait without unraveling, perhaps she could too. Vesper sat directly in front of the ER doors, exactly where he had planted himself hours earlier. His posture had not changed. His breathing was slow and even, but his eyes remained bright, alert, tracking every shadow that passed beneath the door. At 5 years old, he carried no gray in his muzzle yet, but there was an ageless patience in him, the kind earned through work and trust rather than years. He did not whine or shift restlessly. He listened. That was what he did best. Listening had saved a life once already tonight. He would not abandon it now. Inside the emergency room, the fight continued. Dr. Ainsley Kerr stood at the foot of Miles Calloway's bed, her hands steady, her voice calm and precise. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with auburn hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun and sharp green eyes that missed little. Ainsley had built her reputation in trauma units where hesitation could be fatal. She believed deeply in protocol, not as a shield against emotion, but as a bridge between chaos and survival. Tonight, that belief was being tested. Miles lay beneath layers of warming blankets, his body slowly coaxed back from the edge. Heat had been applied methodically, increment by increment, careful not to shock his fragile system. His skin had regained a hint of color, faint but unmistakable, and his heart rhythm, once erratic and barely present, had settled into a fragile, stubborn pattern. Tubes and wires traced his form like the careful stitches of a mended thing, each monitor a quiet witness to his refusal to let go. "Core temperature is rising," a nurse reported softly. Ainsley nodded. "Good. Keep it gradual, no shortcuts." She watched the monitor closely, her expression composed but intent. She knew the statistics. She knew how often severe hypothermia ended badly, even after rescue. But she also knew something else, something not taught in textbooks. Sometimes the body held on because something, or someone, was calling it back. Hours later, when the worst of the danger had finally loosened its grip, Ainsley stepped out into the waiting room. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and every head snapped up. Bo rose so fast his chair skidded backward, the sound sharp against the floor. Lila stood as well, heart pounding, one hand braced against the armrest. Vesper was on his feet instantly, ears forward, body aligned, eyes locked onto the figure emerging from the light. Dr. Kerr removed her gloves slowly, deliberately, as if choosing each movement with care. Her face was neutral, but not cold. It was the expression of a woman balancing truth and hope in the same breath. "He's stable," she said quietly. The words landed like a held breath finally released. Bo's knees weakened, and he had to steady himself against the wall. Lila covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now, unchecked and unashamed. Somewhere behind them, someone whispered, "Thank God," into the quiet. Ainsley continued, her tone firm, grounding the moment in reality. "We rewarmed him slowly. His heart rhythm is holding. He's not out of danger yet, but if you had waited longer, if he'd been buried, he wouldn't have made it." No one cheered. They exhaled. The kind of exhale that comes when the body realizes it has survived something it did not fully understand while it was happening. Vesper did not bark. He did not pace or whine. He simply stepped closer to the door, tail low but relaxed, as if the news confirmed something he had known all along, and he was merely waiting for the humans to catch up. Later, when the ICU had settled into a quieter rhythm and the machines had found a steadier song, Dr. Kerr made a decision that bent the rules without breaking them. 5 minutes, she said to Bo, meeting his eyes. No jumping, no chaos. Bo nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He clipped Vesper's leash with hands that still shook and followed Ainsley down the hall, past signs and stations that blurred together until they reached the room. Vesper entered first, his steps slow and reverent, as if he understood the gravity of the space. The lights were dimmed, casting soft shadows across the walls. Miles lay, pale but alive, wrapped in blankets, his chest rising more visibly now, each breath a quiet victory. His face looked thinner, sharper, as if winter had carved something away. But there was warmth there too, a hint of return. Vesper approached the bed and stopped, waiting. Bo whispered, "It's okay," his voice raw. The dog stepped closer and rested his head gently against the edge of the mattress, careful not to disturb the wires or the fragile human beneath them. He did not lick, he did not nudge. He simply offered presence. Miles's fingers twitched, weak, uncertain, but deliberate. They curled slowly into the thick fur at Vesper's neck, gripping just enough to be real. Bo turned away then, pressing his fist to his mouth as tears finally claimed him. Lila watched from the doorway, her chest aching with a strange, overwhelming gratitude. Dr. Kerr stood back, arms crossed loosely, observing with the quiet respect of someone who had seen science do its work and had learned not to dismiss the rest. Sometimes, she murmured half to herself, the body comes back because it's called by something it trusts. Vesper blinked once, slow and calm, as if acknowledging a simple fact. 5 minutes passed. It felt like a lifetime. When they left the room, Christmas lights glowed softly down the hall, and the storm outside seemed just a little less angry. Hearthstone Pass had been given a gift it did not expect and did not deserve, but would never forget. Not fireworks, a candle, small, steady, breathing. Miles Calloway did not walk out of the hospital on Christmas morning. That would have been a lie dressed up as hope, and Hearthstone Pass had already learned what lies could cost when winter was involved. The morning came anyway, pale and hushed, the sky rinsed clean by snowfall that had finally eased into something gentler. Christmas bells rang from the small church on Main Street, their sound thin but persistent, drifting through the cold air like a promise that refused to be buried. The town woke slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that moving too fast might undo the fragile miracle it had been handed. In a quiet room on the ICU floor, Miles lay surrounded by machines that spoke softly on his behalf. His breathing was steadier now, no longer the shallow whisper that had fooled trained eyes, but it was still work. Every inhale seemed earned. His skin carried color again, faint, uneven, but real, and the blue had retreated from his lips like a defeated tide. He slept often, dragged under by exhaustion deeper than any dream, his body busy repairing what winter had tried to erase. Dr. Ainsley Kerr checked his chart with careful focus, her posture straight, her expression thoughtful. She had seen patients come back from worse odds, and she had also seen people slip away after moments that looked just like this. She trusted progress, not victory. Still, when she adjusted the blankets and saw Miles's chest rise and fall without the machine prompting it, something warm flickered behind her eyes. "You're stubborn," she murmured, not unkindly. "That's going to help." Sheriff Bo Rourke visited every day, his presence filling the room even when he said nothing. He brought news from the town, how the roads were slowly reopening, how Mrs. Halverson insisted on lighting the tree even if no one came, how the kids down by the river had built a lopsided snowman and declared it a monument. Bo spoke quietly, not wanting to overwhelm the man who had nearly slipped through the cracks of certainty. He sat heavy in the chair beside the bed, hands folded, grounding himself in routine the way he always had. Deputy Lila Moreno stopped by too, usually on her way off shift, hair damp from melted snow, eyes tired but bright. She talked about small things, paperwork piling up, a cat stuck in a chimney, the coffee machine at the station finally breaking for good. She never mentioned the casket unless Miles asked, and he never did. Some things didn't need revisiting to leave a mark, and Vesper waited. He was not allowed in the ICU anymore, rules reasserting themselves once the crisis had passed, but he stationed himself just outside whenever Bo visited. He sat straight back near the wall, leash slack, ears swiveling at the sound of familiar footsteps. Nurses smiled when they passed him, some stopping to scratch behind his ears, others simply nodding as if greeting a colleague. In those halls, Vesper was no longer just a K9. He was a reminder of attention, of refusal. Recovery was slow, painstaking, honest. Miles woke in fragments at first, disoriented, his mind struggling to stitch memory back together. He remembered snow, the howl of wind, the sense of moving through white nothingness. He remembered thinking about Vesper, whether the dog had been secured, whether someone would remember to give him water. That thought, absurd and persistent, had anchored him more than fear. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and thin. Vesper? Bo had smiled then, the kind of smile that hurt your face because it pulled on everything you'd been holding in. He's right outside, he said. Hasn't gone far. Miles closed his eyes again, not from exhaustion this time, but from relief. Weeks passed. Snow melted in patches, then returned, then melted again, as winter slowly loosened its grip on Hearthstone Pass. Miles learned to sit up, then to stand, then to walk short distances with help. Each step felt like negotiating with gravity itself. His muscles protested, his lungs burned, and there were mornings when the light through the window felt too sharp, too much like an accusation. Dr. Kerr never rushed him. "You don't owe anyone speed," she reminded him. "You owe yourself honesty." The county launched its review quietly but thoroughly. Dr. Everett Shaw returned to his home county after the roads reopened, his shoulders visibly lighter, but his expression changed. He cooperated fully, admitting what winter, exhaustion, and faulty equipment had conspired to hide. Power failures, unreliable monitors, a body slowed to near stillness by cold. There was no malice in the report, only accountability. The phrase echoed through the final documentation like a refrain that should have been remembered sooner. No one is dead until warm and dead. Bo took that line and turned it into policy. Storm protocols were rewritten. Double confirmation became mandatory when hypothermia was a possibility. Warming attempts were required before any declaration, regardless of pressure, regardless of roads, regardless of how badly people wanted closure. Bo signed the changes with a firm hand, not out of anger, but out of resolve. He had nearly buried one of his own. He would not let the town forget what winter could disguise. When Miles finally returned to the station, it was a quiet affair. There was no banner, no ceremony, just a handful of deputies lingering under the excuse of paperwork, pretending not to watch the door too closely. Snow dusted the steps outside, sunlight catching in the crystals like scattered glass. Miles stepped out of Bo's truck slowly, thinner than before, his face sharper, his movements careful. He wore civilian clothes, his uniform still waiting for a body that fully trusted itself again. Vesper sat near the entrance, harness on, posture perfect. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Miles knelt, the cold biting through his jeans, and clipped Vesper's leash himself. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he was touching. "Guess you saved me," he said quietly, voice rough, eyes shining. Vesper sneezed. It was abrupt, inelegant, and deeply offended. A ripple of laughter moved through the small group watching, breaking tension that had lived in their chests for weeks. Miles laughed too, a sound that surprised him with its ease. Vesper leaned his shoulder into Miles's knee then, half hug, half anchor, solid and warm and unmistakably present. That night, the town gathered in the square. Lights flickered on the tree, brighter than usual, as if overcompensating for what might have been lost. Children shouted, Someone played a slightly out-of-tune carol on a portable speaker. The cold pressed in, but no one seemed to mind. Breath fogged the air, laughter rose, and Hearthstone Pass felt, for the first time in weeks, like itself again. Miles stood with Vesper at his side, watching the glow, feeling the steady pull of the leash in his hand. He understood something then, something simple and unromantic and deeply true. Sometimes love doesn't feel like comfort. Sometimes it feels like refusal, a dog refusing to accept the wrong ending, a town refusing to let winter have the last word, a Christmas refusing to become a funeral. And in the falling snow, a story took root, not of magic, but of loyalty so fierce it sounded like truth, passed quietly from porch to porch, told with laughter dampened by tears. Hearthstone Pass remembered that Christmas not for what it lost, but for what listened and would not let go. In the quiet ending of this story, we are reminded that the miracles of God do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes they come through a loyal dog who refuses to give up. Sometimes they come through a tired town that chooses to listen instead of rushing to the wrong conclusion. And sometimes they come through a single breath that returns when everyone believed it was gone. In our daily lives, we also face moments that feel final, seasons of loss, exhaustion, fear, or silence when we are tempted to believe there is no other ending. But God is still working even in those quiet hours. He teaches us patience when the world demands speed. He teaches us hope when logic tells us to surrender. And He reminds us that no life and no heart is ever beyond His reach. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and what this story made you feel. If you believe in the gentle miracles God still sends into our lives, please type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And please remember to press subscribe to support this YouTube channel so we can continue bringing you stories of faith, love, loyalty, and quiet miracles.